So this has been a thorny issue for the NFL for many months now. And Lindsay, you and our colleague Stephen Holder recently wrote about some of the pressure players face when it comes to getting vaccinated. But first, can you give us some numbers? Roughly how many NFL players these days are vaccinated?
Sure. So there hasn't been a dramatic shift in the NFL's vaccination rates over the last month or so. They're right around 94% of players who are in the vaccination process. So the NFL counts players who have had at least one shot of a Moderna or a Pfizer vaccine as being in the vaccination process, or the one shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine, or they also count players as fully vaccinated if they had a previous case of COVID plus one shot. So if you do all the math, if you go through all of the rosters, there's about 2,200 active players in the NFL. Basically, what we're talking about is about 160 players who, at this point, about a month into the season, that remain unvaccinated.
What teams are 100% vaccinated, and do we know which teams are the least vaccinated?
Yeah, so the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Atlanta Falcons both have announced that they were 100% vaccinated, along with the Las Vegas Raiders. They were the third team to join. The league hasn't officially announced where every team is at. They're kind of letting each team speak for themselves. So we know the teams that are 100% vaccinated. What I've heard, what I've been told, and then kind of what we also know anecdotally is the teams that are at the bottom: Minnesota Vikings, the Indianapolis Colts, the Jacksonville Jaguars. Some of the teams that have had some pretty well documented issues. The Vikings and the Colts are notable there because both of their starting quarterbacks have confirmed that they remain unvaccinated.
All right, well, as I mentioned, you recently wrote about how different life is for players who have gotten the shot compared to those who haven't. So paint us a picture here, Lindsay. What is life like for NFL players who have refused to get vaccinated?
Yeah, so it's largely what it was like in 2020 during the pandemic season, where there are a ton of restrictions that are placed on unvaccinated players. You're not able to eat meals in the cafeteria with your teammates, but you have to wear a mask at all times when you're inside the building. That includes when you're doing media interviews. You cannot gather with your teammates in the weight room. There's restrictions on a number of people that can be in the training room. There are significant restrictions on travel. There's also restrictions on things like charity events and community service events. The testing is another major difference. Unvaccinated players are required to be tested every single day. This is similar to the 2020 season. They have to show up at the building earlier. The timing varies from team to team, but most places it's pretty early in the morning. Basically what happens is an unvaccinated player will show up at, let's say, 6 a.m., go in, get his swab. He has to go back and wait in his car for 30, 45 minutes, an hour until he gets his result and is able to go in the building. Vaccinated players have to be tested once every 7 days, and there is no restriction. They are able to get swabbed, head right into the building. So that's a big deal.
It also sounds like players who are not vaccinated might have trouble getting contract offers. Can you explain why this might be the case?
Yeah, so this is one other kind of challenge here now, is that vaccinated players, they can sign and participate with a new team immediately. Richard Sherman, who just signed with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on Wednesday, he flew into town Tuesday evening, and he is on the field practicing Wednesday morning. If he was unvaccinated, it takes 5 days to get kind of in the process. So what we're seeing is free agent players that might be unvaccinated. They're going ahead and they're getting their shots now, because if they don't, they're not probably going to get a shot to play again in the NFL this year.
Well, in addition to all of the rules, I imagine players must also face pressure in some way or another from coaches and teammates. What have you been hearing on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot of different conflicts, I think, going on, and a lot of different frustrations going on. I mean, there was a lot during training camp in the preseason where I think coaches were really frustrated with the players who weren't vaccinated. Ron Rivera, the head coach of the Washington football team, I mean, he's been a very vocal proponent of the vaccine and why everybody, not just his players, should get it.
I think the big thing more than anything else is just where our country is. I mean, you get concerned that we're sliding backwards, and now all of a sudden it's like we got comfortable. We got to be careful to be comfortable. And that's one thing I want to get across to our team. And it's also been kind
I mean, everybody probably knows the story of what Ron Rivera went through last year. He was actively going through chemotherapy and cancer treatments last year. So he was a high risk individual. And so, he kind of called out players.
I'm truly frustrated. I'm beyond frustrated, and part of it is, and the reason I walked in with the mask on is, I'm immune deficient. And so I have to do that. And I just wish and I hope that our guys can understand that.
Coaches just want it to be all about football, and they hate having anything that is extra where they're worrying about, is this guy going to be available or not? They have enough to worry about with ankles and shoulders. And now you have to throw in, is he a high risk close contact?
And so tell us how all of this has played out for some of the players you wrote about in your story.
Yeah, I mean, so there have been players who have said, okay, fine, I'll get vaccinated. Isaiah McKenzie, who's a wide receiver with the Buffalo Bills, he very publicly posted on his social media accounts when he got fined by the NFL for protocol violations for not wearing his mask around the facility, and they fined him. And about a day later, he posted a picture of him with his vaccine card and said, fine, I'll get my shot. Denzel Perryman, who plays for the Las Vegas Raiders, he, really talked about how there were like two worlds. It was like the haves and the have-nots. And eventually he gave in.
And for the record, I am thinking about the vaccination now. Yeah, I ain't gonna lie. There's too many restrictions going on and can't even eat with my fellow brothers. So, yeah, I don't like being an outcast.
And now the Raiders are 100% vaccinated. So, some of this stuff is working. And there are, I think, a lot of lessons that the rest of society and other corporations and professional sports leagues, there's just a lot of lessons, I think, that can be taken from the way that the NFL has done this. They were not able to mandate vaccines, but they incentivized it and then put enough kind of restrictions and penalties that people who maybe were on the fence felt like it was the right thing, finally, personally, for them to do, whether they believed in the science or not.
In driving the numbers up. Youth sports are seemingly going on as if the pandemic unfortunately didn't even exist. How concerned are you about the extent to which young athletes are being exposed?
Well, if you look at the facts, Brian, it tells you that you should be concerned, because when you look at youngsters, adolescents who are in sports, the transmission in the context of sports, particularly contact sports, or even moderately contact sports, that's where you see the numbers of infection much greater than in the school in general. In fact, it's interesting that the District of Columbia, where I live, the mayor now has said student athletes need to be vaccinated, which is really interesting because that's a recognition of the increased risk among the athletes who are in that contact situation of most of the high school sports.
You're a father of three girls, one of whom, Allison, was a D1 athlete.
Yes.
If you're a young parent today, would you let your children participate in an outdoor sport?
I would, Brian, just because I realize it means so much to them. When you were speaking about my daughter, she was in college, so she would be eligible to be vaccinated. If she were fully vaccinated, I would feel comfortable with her being on the crew team right now without any problem.